In the heart of France, a social time bomb is ticking faster every day. Anger stemming from the colonial past, the never-ending drug trade, and abandoned lives. Today we will not be talking about the fashion capital, but about the invisible war in the backstreets of Paris. Paris suburbs. This word comes from medieval Latin. Initially, it only represented settlements outside the center, but today in France it carries a much heavier meaning: poverty and exclusion. Leave aside wealthy exceptions like Neuilly-sur-Seine. Today we will look at the story of immigrants from former colonies, young people trying to make a living, and millions labeled as potential criminals. Is this a coincidence or an inevitable consequence of France's integration policies? We are about to examine the real face behind the glamorous shop windows. If you are curious about the unseen face of the world, welcome to Mysterious Atlas. When World War II ended, France was in ruins. The German occupation and Allied bombing during the war had severely damaged the infrastructure of the cities. Approximately 1,200,000 homes were completely destroyed, and about 2 million homes were severely damaged. However, Paris did not suffer widespread destruction during the occupation because it was not strategically bombed. After the war, many citizens whose cities had been destroyed began to migrate to Paris. However, there wasn't enough housing for everyone. In the post-war period, France began rebuilding its cities with aid received from the United States under the Marshall Plan. It was during this period that the decision was made to build large apartment blocks that formed the banlieue. Thus, huge apartment blocks were built on the outskirts of Paris and other major cities. The post-war period was also a period of industrial and economic development for France. During this time, migration from rural areas to cities accelerated. The inhabitants of these first baths were French people who had migrated from rural areas to the cities. Despite internal migration, there was still a significant labor shortage. To meet this need, they allowed people to come from North African countries such as Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, from sub-Saharan African countries such as Senegal and Mali, and from French overseas territories in the Caribbean such as Martinique, Guatemala, and Doloub. In addition, hundreds of thousands of people from Portugal and Spain migrated to France to work due to difficult economic conditions in their own countries. These migration movements increased the number of bathhouses day by day. At first glance, the bathhouses, promising a modern future, saw immigrants bringing their families along with them thanks to the family reunification law. Everything seemed to be going well. Immigrants were contributing to the French economy with their labor force and living in better conditions than in their places of origin. France was experiencing a period of significant economic growth, known as the Glorious Years, 1968. That was until the tide turned in the 1970 seconds. Just before the 1970 seconds, the famous May 1968 events had given the first signal of what was to come. In fact, the protests started by university students spread throughout society. France was experiencing its 30th year of prosperity, but this wealth was not fairly distributed. As a result, workers complained of low wages, and students, consequently, worried about their future. At that time, Charles de Gaulle was the president of France. Charles de Gaulle, who had risen to national hero status through his refusal to surrender to the Germans during World War II and his leadership during and after the war, was targeted by various actions. The event that truly changed everything for Bani occurred in 1973. The 1973 oil crisis also created a major economic crisis. The French stock market plummeted sharply. Inflation and unemployment increased. As a result, the French economy shrank for 3 consecutive years. The effects of the 1973 crisis lasted until the 1980 seconds. When the economy recovered in the 1980 seconds, many French people living in the suburbs mostly left and moved to city centers. The Bani neighborhoods, built with great hopes, eventually became places inhabited almost exclusively by immigrants, symbols of poverty and exclusion. Today, to understand the Bani problem in France, it's necessary to look at the foundations laid in those years. Because the walls of these buildings were not only built with concrete, but also the fate of future generations. From the outside, These baths, built in an orderly fashion according to modern urban planning principles, are now trapped in a cycle of poverty. Children born into this cycle cannot escape the shadow of poverty because they face many sociological obstacles and problems. The unemployment rate among the people living here is 3 times higher than the national average. Half of the children live below the poverty line and grow up in these conditions. Living in Balliol, and especially having an immigrant background, creates an invisible but known obstacle that no one admits to each other in finding a job. The schools in these neighborhoods do not offer a positive light in breaking this vicious cycle, because teachers assigned to schools in the Banny districts want to leave quickly. This lowers the quality of education. Since the state struggles to maintain authority, rules in the schools are often broken. Discipline problems occur. There are not enough nurseries for preschool education. Sports fields, crucial for protecting young people from the dangers of the streets, are either closed or in ruins due to neglect. Children born in Banny essentially start life at a disadvantage. Furthermore, healthcare services are inadequately provided. The number of doctors per capita in Banny is less than half the national average. As a result, many families struggle to access even the most basic healthcare. Consequently, poverty is passed down through generations like a chain reaction. A young person whose father is unemployed cannot escape the same fate. Even if both parents work, families struggle to make ends meet. This feeling of being trapped eventually turns into anger. I mentioned an invisible barrier earlier. I need to elaborate on this. I believe this is the fundamental reason why the problems of people of immigrant origin living in Banny remain unresolved and are increasingly turning into discrimination. A child born in Banny faces discrimination from the moment they take their first steps in life. At school, when applying for jobs, in places they go for entertainment, and even during identity checks. In France, there is a non-governmental organization against discrimination and racism called SOS Racisme. Known for its close ties to the French Socialist Party, this organization conducted experiments to document and highlight the discrimination faced by immigrants. For example, one experiment involved applying to job postings. The organization prepared identical CVs, differing only in the names. One CV included a name or surname that clearly indicated the applicant was an immigrant. The other included a name and surname combination that suggested the applicant was French. Unfortunately, the CVs that clearly indicated an immigrant received fewer responses. They even discovered that employers used discriminatory codes in their databases. The BBR code was an abbreviation for the colors of the French flag and referred to people of French origin. NBBRS was the code for non-French individuals, and their CVs were often not even considered. Moreover, discrimination was much more pronounced for educated immigrants. The unemployment rate among university graduates of French origin is only around 5%. However, for those with the same degree, for example, those of North African origin, this rate rises to over 26%. In other words, even if young people of immigrant origin received an education, they felt that the doors to the future were closing in their faces. The general unemployment figures in the neighborhoods make this picture even darker. In some neighborhoods, the unemployment rate rises to over 40%. Those who find jobs mostly find low-skilled and consequently low-paying jobs. Another experiment involved recording the entrances of nightclubs with hidden cameras. Nightclub security refused entry to many people who could be identified as immigrants by their skin tone, appearance, speech, or any other detail. Similarly, the procedure of denying entry to those who were clearly French by appearance was applied very rarely. Besides all this, the relationship between the youth of the suburbs and the police is a major, festering wound. One of the routine practices of the police on the streets is conducting identity checks. However, the French police almost exclusively stop non-immigrants for these checks. This practice undermines trust between the police and immigrants. Some reports in the French media revealed that French police officers are almost never punished for crimes committed against immigrants. The Lemant newspaper summarized the situation as follows: "Justice has a special tariff for the police. They are never seriously punished." Reports from international organizations claim that the judicial system in France protects and covers up police violence. But there was also another side to the story. Far-right politicians, particularly Jean-Marie Le Pen, argue that the young people of Bani are actually untouchable, and that most should either be deported or stripped of their citizenship. According to them, the state is tying the hands of the police under pressure from pro-immigrant left-wing organizations. All these facts present a harsh picture for millions of people living in the Bali regions of France. Unemployment, discrimination, distrust of the police, and the sharp polarization of politics all combine to create a volatile situation at the bottom of French society, ready to explode at any moment. This volatile situation has produced major upheavals to date. Many times, immigrants have taken to the streets and rioted. The first major incident involving immigrants in France was the 1961 Paris massacre. Algeria, a French colony for 130 years, launched a war of independence against France in 1954. The Socialist National Liberation Front, which led the War of Independence, was also organized among hundreds of thousands of Algerian immigrant workers living in France. At that time, approximately 200,000 Algerian immigrants lived in France. The National Liberation Front was both collecting money for the war and using these immigrants for propaganda purposes. The French police and government viewed this as a threat to internal security. The then Paris police chief, Maurice Pupin, took harsh measures against Algerians. In September 1961, a curfew was imposed, specifically targeting Algerians, prohibiting them from being out after 8:30 p.m. To protest this, Algerians organized a peaceful march on the 17th of October 1961. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children took to the streets of Paris. The police intervened very harshly. Hundreds were beaten and arrested. Many were thrown into the Seine River. There is no definitive figure for the death toll. While the French government claimed for many years that the number was around 40, historians accept that between 100 and 300 people were killed. The event was largely ignored in official history. The French state censored the event, and reporting on it was forbidden. However, immigrant and human rights organizations kept this hidden massacre in the public eye. From the 1990 seconds onwards, when the archives were opened, the true extent of the problem became clear. Although the 1961 Paris massacre was the first large-scale riot instigated by immigrants in France, it was not entirely a bathroom riot. The first true bathroom riot occurred in 1979 inches, the Vonville suburb of Lyon. This neighborhood was predominantly inhabited by immigrant families from Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. Following the 1973 oil crisis, unemployment had risen steadily, and the future looked bleak for young people. Young people were becoming involved in crime, and the neighborhood had already been labeled a troubled area by the state. One evening in 1979, police stopped a group of immigrant youths for identity checks. However, the police's harsh and condescending attitude ignited the tension that had been building in the neighborhood for some time. A small argument quickly escalated. When the young people resisted the police, other young people joined in, and the dispute instantly turned into a mass protest. The events continued for several days. Immigrants attacked the police with stones and Molotov cocktails and set vehicles on fire. The police struggled to control the area. This event was reported in the national press as the first large-scale violent movement in an immigrant barrios in France. In 1983, a large-scale immigrant riot erupted in Vénissieux, a suburb of Lyon. Like Vonville, Vénissieux was a suburb with a high concentration of immigrants. High unemployment, poverty, low education levels, and frequent clashes with the police were part of the daily life there. In the early 1982, racism and police violence, particularly against young people of Marip origin, were frequently discussed throughout France. In July 1983, a 19-year-old of Algerian origin, Amido Marzouk, died during a police chase. This death was the last straw for the already angry youth. Vehicles were set on fire, police were attacked with stones and Molotov cocktails, and barricades were erected. The events continued for days. The police struggled to control the neighborhood. The French Ministry of the Interior described the events as the work of criminal immigrant youth. However, The media and sociologists wrote that it was not just a wave of crime, but a rebellion against social exclusion and racism. This event was also a turning point in France, where young people of immigrant origin loudly voiced their demand, "We are also citizens of this country." In 2005, the largest suburban riot in French history occurred. Clichy-sous-Bois suburb, northeast of Paris, was a place with a large immigrant population, high unemployment rates, widespread poverty, and frequent tensions between the police and young people due to social exclusion. On the 27th of October 2005, one 5-year-old Bouna Traoré of African descent, one 7-year-old Ziadet Benah of Marib descent, and one 7-year-old Muhittin Altoun of Turkish descent hid in an electrical transformer while fleeing a police checkpoint. Bounatra and Ziadet Benah died from electrocution. Muhittin Altoun was seriously injured. News of the incident quickly spread throughout the neighborhood. That night, anger erupted in Clichy-sous-Bois. Cars were burned, public buildings were stoned, and clashes with the police ensued. The events quickly spread beyond this neighborhood. Riots began in Saint-Saint-Denis, then in Lyon, Lille, and Marseille, among other cities around Paris. For 3 weeks, hundreds of vehicles were set ablaze every night. In total, more than 10,000 vehicles were burned. Police and firefighters were constantly targeted. Then Interior Minister Nicolas Sarkozy described those involved as rabble and increased police repression. On the 8th of November 2005, the government invoked a state of emergency law, the same law enacted during the 1955 Algerian War. This was the first time it had been applied in France in half a century. The riots were brought under control on the 21st of November 2005. The official death toll was recorded as 3. Hundreds were injured. Thousands of young people were detained. The extent of material damage amounted to hundreds of millions. Historians generally describe this event as France's largest internal riot since 1968. After lengthy legal proceedings, the police officers responsible for the deaths of Bouna Traoré and Ziadet Benah were acquitted in 2015, clearing them under French law. The last major uprising occurred in 2023 inches Nanterre, a suburb of Paris. On the 27th of June 2023, one 7-year-old Nahel Merzouk of Algerian origin was driving without a license when police attempted to stop him. Following a short chase, police cornered his vehicle. One of 2 police officers approached the car, and when Nahel started driving again, he opened fire at close range. Nahel died at the scene. The incident, recorded by a witness on their mobile phone, quickly spread on social media. That same evening, hundreds of young people took to the streets, clashing with police. Barricades were erected, and vehicles and garbage containers were set on fire. The events were not limited to Nanterre. They quickly spread to the Barnilles surrounding Paris. From June 29th onwards, riots erupted nationwide. Violent clashes occurred in major cities such as Lyon, Lille, Marseille, Toulouse, Strasbourg, and Nice. Public buildings, schools, and shops were attacked. Thousands of vehicles were burned. Police and gendarmerie units were targeted with stones, fireworks, and Molotov cocktails. Curfews were imposed in many cities. President Emmanuel Macron described the event as unforgivable and deployed 45,000 police and gendarmes to suppress the protests. The Interior Ministry quickly announced that more than 3,000 people had been detained. The harsh statements made by police officials, especially the "we are at war" rhetoric, drew widespread public outrage. Nahel's death brought back to the forefront the long-standing issues of police brutality, racism, and the exclusion of young people in ban. Debates on police reform in France intensified. For young people in Bonn, Nahel suddenly became a victim of the system and a symbol of resistance. The international community also showed great interest in the event. Protests against police brutality in France took place in many countries. Applause. The 2023 Nanterre events were recorded as the largest uprising in France since the 2005 Clichy-sous-Bois riots. More than €1 billion in material damage occurred nationwide. The events deepened social polarization and increased pressure on security and immigration policies. Nahel's name has become synonymous with the demands for justice and equality among young people in the suburbs of France. This event marked the latest turning point, suggesting that the Balliol crisis in France is far from over and is still ongoing. The Banny issue presents two different faces on the French political stage. On one side are those who see the solution in investments in education, social services, and job creation for young people. This approach aims to eradicate violence by reducing poverty and exclusion. On the other side are those who advocate for tightening security measures, increasing police presence, and implementing zero-tolerance policies. According to them, the problem is not integration, but a lack of discipline. Billions of euros have been spent in the last 20 years. Many infrastructure projects have been undertaken. But the unchanging reality is that the suburbs are still the problematic periphery of France. France's Republican ideal is based on the understanding that everyone is equal, everyone is French. According to this principle, everyone living within the country's borders is equal and considered French. However, for young people of immigrant origin in the suburbs, this is often just a promise on paper, because they neither feel fully French nor can they fully belong to their family's culture. This void of belonging is filled in different ways. For some, religion becomes a refuge. For others, neighborhood culture becomes the sole support of their identity, while for others, anger turns into violence. In the minds of young people, the same questions constantly echo. Who are we? Are we French? Or will we always remain foreigners? Will we always be excluded? Or will we one day truly be equal citizens of this country? That's all from me for today. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment to support me. Take care. Goodbye.